Thank you again for all of you guys for joining our workshop. So to officially start, welcome to our Mind and Money workshop on wellness for international students. And as you guys probably already read on our event page, this workshop is on financial management, and we will be also covering how finances relate to our mental health specifically, and also provide you guys a guide on how to overcome barriers to achieve your financial security. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce our presenters for the workshop today. We are joined today with Global Shapers team, which we're very lucky to have partnered with us for this workshop. And then, I'll begin introducing GYLN team. So I am Nadia from the University of Alberta, and I have here with me Adnan and Radha, which are also current and former U Alberta students. And from the Global Shapers team, we have. Would someone like to switch the slide? Right, okay. So from the Global Shapers team, we have Alex, Stephen, Nick, and Mike, and Anu. So you guys will be seeing more of us throughout the presentation. And from here, I'll pass it on to Radha to talk about background research as well as our agenda.
Thank you, Nadia, for that introduction. Before we jump into the meat of the workshop today, I just want to make sure that I kind of give some context about why we're here today. So the research that we did showed us that there was a lack of resources in the topics of mental health and financial wellness, especially for international students who faced a unique barrier given their status in Canada, the cost of international tuition, the cost of living rising, and things like that. Something that we also learned was that our mental health is directly impacted by our financial situation. This is something that's very clear whenever you don't, whenever you're feeling financially unwell, unable to pay the bills, that can really impact your mental health. And then those two kind of go hand in hand together. So because of this clear connection between financial security and well-being, we wanted to present a workshop on exactly this topic. So I'll walk you through what we're going to be walking through today. So if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you, Alex. So we just went through the intro and background. So what we're going to do next is jump right into the mental wellness part of it. After that, we're going to talk about a few topics related to financial literacy. So managing debit and credit, your personal taxes, since tax season is upon us, understanding your paycheck, and then finally, budgeting and planning, what to do with the income or the finances that you do have. Then we're going to go into resources and any Q&A, answer questions that you have. And finally, this is not on the agenda, but we are doing a giveaway, like I'm sure everyone is aware. So the first 10 people to have registered and who's here will get a gift card, and 10 more will be randomly selected. So FYI, in case your name is different from the name that you used to register, or you're anonymous, just shoot me a DM to make sure that we're aligned, and we'll do the giveaway and announce the winners at the end. With that, I will pass it over to Stephen and Nadia.
Sounds great. So welcome everyone. What is mental health overall? I know that this culture has changed. This question used to, be less, well known, but I think with the change in terms of the climate as well as everything, people generally have a better idea as to what it is, but I'll kind of go a little bit into it. So as we all know, physical health, it's all pretty self-explanatory, how we feel, stuff like that. Our mental health is very similar, but it's just kind of the well-being of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we tend to associate this with mental illness, which I'll go into a little bit. So generally, at least in Canada, 1 in people will struggle with a mental illness, but overall, 5 in 5. So that means everyone at some point in their life will struggle with their mental health. So, and you'll kind of see in the next slide what this kind of means and what this looks like. So our mental health exists within a spectrum. So there's our physical health. So just like at any point we can kind of be healthy or feeling really crappy, being ill. Mental health is the same thing. So we can kind of exist within healthy. So that usually means that we're feeling great. We're not really stressed out. We have good self-care practices, maybe some good community supports. Maybe you're feeling at home in terms of the U of A community. stuff like that. So even if you are super stressed about midterms, about finding a job, because I know we all are, or just about everything that's going on in the world, if we have proper self-care and social supports, we can kind of get through those, no real problem. Generally, if you are struggling, that usually means things are a little bit harder. Usually this means that like you're struggling with something for a lot longer. It's usually around 2 weeks is how some people like to kind of look at it. And it's kind of affecting your day-to-day. Generally in that aspect, you'll require some community supports to kind of feel a little bit better, in addition to all these other things. And then finally you have crisis, which generally means there's harm to either yourself or others in some way, shape, or form. And usually at that point, emergency services and intervention is kind of required. So it's important to kind of recognize that. So we'll kind of jump into the next thing, which is kind of the mental illness part. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, in Canada, around 1 in 4 individuals at some point will be diagnosed with a mental illness. So mental illness is specifically a cluster of symptoms that will greatly impact a person's life. So I'm sure many of you have heard of these at some point in some way, shape, or form, whether that be anxiety, whether that be depression, whether that be post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia. All of those things are essentially like things that can be diagnosed with a psychiatrist and through a mental health assessment. And generally, these are irregular patterns that might be impacting any of your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors at all. And generally, this is separate from mental health itself. You can have, it's something that's separate than your own mental health. It is a part of it, but it is a different component. So just being aware of where you might lie on this. You can have several, or you can have no diagnosed mental illnesses. So in the next section, you'll see that both of these kind of intersect in this quadrilateral thing that I used to see all the time and when I took math. And once I stopped studying math, I didn't really see these charts anymore. But a fun thing about this is that you'll see, if you press next, is that you can kind of exist within any 4 of these quadrants or anywhere just in this entire spectrum. So you could be having schizophrenia diagnosis and depression and other like things that you're dealing with in terms of mental illness, but still be doing really, really well in terms of your mental health, because maybe you have people in your life, maybe you're taking medication, maybe you're seeing counseling, all of those pieces. Or you can be on the exact opposite end. You might have no mental illness at all, but you're really struggling due to, just so many things that are happening in the world, whether that be the loss of a loved one, all of these things. And I'm sure many of us might have been in anywhere of those areas, especially over the past 2 years, with the various changes that we have all been able to go through, and totally not stressful at all. So now let's kind of dive into what impacts our mental health. So what does that kind of look like, right? So first part is the very small bottom piece of biology and genetics. So kind of how your brain is originally impacted by your genetics. Things like that. Is there drug use, alcohol, physical trauma, chemical imbalances, that basic piece over there. The next part is generally your individual environment, which is what we're going to be spending most of our time talking about today. So this is kind of your current social situation. It's kind of like the supports and services you have access to. So for most of us, that could be existing in Edmonton. It could be existing at the University of Alberta, taking school, dealing with all these things that are currently happening at the U of A. So all of those pieces, it could relate to your physical health, like are you eating properly? Are you having lots of friends that you can kind of hang out with? Or are you kind of self-isolated for whatever reason? Things like those pieces. I know, like, are you feeling safe in this environment? Stuff like that. One part of this, your individual environment, which is the finances, right? So do you kind of, how is your financial situation? Is your what your financial background might be, might determine what services you have, the circles that you exist in, all of these pieces that kind of go along with this, and all of those pieces. It also kind of can be your own financial habits as well, and we'll dive a little bit more into that throughout. The next part is culture, so existing within wherever you might be from, and that cultural surrounding around mental health. So I am Taiwanese by descent. So generally not a thing that we really talk about within Taiwanese culture, at least that I've really seen at all. So that is kind of something that I have to deal with in terms of navigating my own mental health and some of the stigma that might exist and some of the things that might exist there. But those are something that's to think about. And also, like, what is the cultural things that are around finances? Lastly, society and structures. So that usually means like what laws might exist, what systems might exist. So like the banking system, is it easy to access the banking system? Are there certain barriers that might be in place because you are an international student or you're someone from abroad? What factors and systems might be in place? Is there any racism, any gender-based discrimination, things like that? So all of these kind of impact in some way, shape our mental health and our well-being. And all of these intersect in so many different ways. But it's kind of nice to know and see and what that looks like. So another way to think about it, which you'll see in the slide, next slide, is another way to think about it is just this like fun little happy wheel. So our overall well-being is composed of these different things. You can add more, you can take some away if you feel like it, but generally your physical health, your emotional well-being, your social well-being, your finances, your academic, your environmental, your spiritual, all those things. And today, we're kind of going to really dive down on that financial piece and hopefully equip you with some skills and some of those things that you can kind of take away. So I'll hand it off to Nadia to discuss the next little bit.
Thank you, Stephen, for the background on the mental health section. And so to dive more into how financial situations actually impact our mental health, I'm going to give you guys a quick question before we talk more into it. So what are some financial situations that you find have impacted your mental health, either in the past or you think would impact your mental health? And feel free to drop your responses in the Zoom chat. And also, if you feel comfortable, also include like the specific negative emotion that you experience as a result of these situations. Yeah, so I'll just give you guys a few seconds to do that. Again, when I say negative emotions, I mean by some examples would be sadness, stress, feeling overwhelmed, or anything like that. Does nobody want to have anything to share on this aspect? If not, it's okay as well. If you guys not comfortable sharing your how financial situation impact your mental health, what I want to point out here is basically there is a clear, strong correlation between being financially insecure and how it affects our overall mental well-being. So to give you guys a better overview on how our financial security impacts mental health in individuals in Canada, here are some statistics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Canadians rank money as one of their greatest stresses, and studies show that stress can lead to insomnia, depression, and lower well-being. People have also reported that financial difficulty has distracted them during work. And so overall, looking at these stats, we can see that financial stress can definitely impact us on how we work in the real world. So what I mean by that is affecting our sleep or distracting us during work. To give another perspective, I have a short story on how one person faced financial difficulty and how that impacted their mental health. Next slide. Thank you. So this person grew up facing a lot of financial difficulties, mainly because their parents had them at a very young age. So they were constantly facing a lot of debt and financial stress. So having to go through, like, they have to constantly go through this uncertainty of not knowing whether they have to move places or afford day-to-day necessities. And the accumulated stress eventually transformed into anxiety and depression, and this affected them. These emotions that result from this financial difficulty affected them in the long term. So from this story, do you find yourself relates to any part of the story? If you do find yourself relate, throw in an emoji, so it can be like a smiley face or a yes or a thumbs up. If you find yourself relating to any part of the story or the negative emotions as a result of your difficulties. Again, I'll give you guys a few seconds. You can access the emojis, by the way, through the reactions button in the lower tab, if you guys could find that. Thank you, Stephen, for reacting.
Lots of emojis coming in, and also FYI, Nadia, in case you missed the chat, lots of
Oh,
responses there as
I
well to
think I
your
missed,
question.
right. Exactly. Sorry, guys. I don't actually have the chat open at this moment. I can't access, like, I can't have both of them. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you guys for your responses. Yeah, it looks like a lot of them are really relevant to a lot of people I know and myself as well. And so, yeah, what I wanted to point out was that financial difficulties definitely affect us on a mental level. Again, and also thank you guys for the reactions. And so now we're going to look at specifically what it actually looks like to be financially well and mentally healthy. So financially healthy means that you have sufficient financial knowledge to manage your income, deal with your taxes, manage debt, and face emergency shortfalls. You also have the ability to save up and reach financial goals. This does not necessarily mean that you have to be financially wealthy. It's more of being in a state of financial security. And on the other hand, mentally healthy looks like when you have the ability to handle and cope with your stressors. When you encounter problems, you can approach these situations in a non-antagonistic way and be able to find a good balance between work and other life aspects. So from here, I'm going to pass it back to Stephen to finish up the mental health section.
For sure. Thank you. So I think, well, I mean, feel free to react if at any point you have ever regretted a financial decision in any way, shape, or form. So let me know if you, once again, through your reactions, if someone has here made any type of financial regret in the past little while, like whether that be not investing in Bitcoin, like several cents, to anything in between, to anything like you're buying things or you have too many credit cards, whatever. See a couple of reacts in there. So if you have, you're not alone. Almost like 83% of Canadians have experienced some type of financial regret, or wish they did something different with their finances. And one thing that generally exists is that we don't really talk about it a whole lot, which makes it difficult to kind of make a difference or educate yourself in a way to create change in yourself and be financially and mentally healthy, right? And one of the reasons for that, I think, is this idea of stigma. So generally, certain topics are taboo in certain places and also might carry some shame, disgrace, or humility, or feelings like that. And some of this is due to our cultural perception. Sometimes it's just due to how people act. But what this can kind of do is it can result in discrimination and things that kind of exist that impact different communities differently. It can result in a lack of access to services, which makes, becoming more financially literate or mentally healthy all the more difficult. And it can be really tough in terms of the self-blame and the negative self-talk that we engage in that can make us feel more shameful and more embarrassed, that then make us continuously more difficult to have conversations around money and kind of things that you need to do to maybe get out of debt or whatever it is that you're kind of doing. So now that we kind of generally did an overview, we want to give you the skills and abilities to kind of be financially healthy and then thus mentally healthy. So I will hand it away to Mike to kind of talk about managing debt and credit.
Hey guys, I'll be talking a little bit about checking and savings account and what they can do for you. So we'll start off with the checking account. Traditional checking accounts are basically transactional accounts. The bank would expect you, being the account holder, to frequently take money from them. So they generally put few restrictions on timing and the amount of transactions you can do. The primary purpose of a checking account is just to hold your money in a secure place, usually for short term. So it's available whenever you need it to, say, pay your bills and other expenses. You can also have your paycheck sent directly into your checking account. This is known as a direct deposit. You can see a sample on the screen. Basically, your employer will ask for one of this slip or for you to submit the information on the slip to them for them to do processing to send money to you. And once this money is in your account, you can move a portion of your earnings to, say, a savings account or an investment account, which can grow over time. we're still on checking. One slide back. Yeah, okay. Checking accounts shouldn't be used for long-term goals, such as saving for a house, since you tend to earn very low interest. Checking accounts also come with a debit card. The debit card that you would receive from the bank allows you to withdraw money from your checking account via like going to an ATM, or you can also pay at the point of sale terminals at a supermarket for your groceries. So when you're doing those payments, the money is directly being deducted from your checking account. Saving accounts don't provide debit cards, though you may be able to use one to access funds if your saving account is linked to your checking account at the same bank. Some checking accounts have fees. These can be monthly fees just to keep your account operational. And there may also be overdraft fees if you take more money out than you actually have. This is why it's good to read the fine print whenever you're going to set up an account. Next, we'll move on to savings account. Savings accounts are closer to a form of like investment when compared to the transactional account, your checking account. You're basically giving the bank access to your funds typically for longer periods so that they can loan most of that money out to earn a return. These accounts tend to have some more restrictions. They can include maintaining a minimum balance and only having few approved transactions per monthly cycle. Interest rates on these accounts tend to be higher due to the fact that the bank is lending out your money, so they'll pay you a bit more interest. All interest you earn will go directly back into your account and will be reflected into your monthly statements. Usually these monthly statements, you'll get them in your online profile, or if you still want paper copy, you can talk to the bank itself. It's good to understand how your bank pays interest to you. Like if the interest will be calculated in layers, say like 1% for 5,000, which could be like a minimum balance, then 2% after, or if it's just a fixed percentage on the overall balance at the end of the month. With the compound interest, your initial deposit or principal would earn interest. The money you earn in interest is then added to your savings. You'll continue to earn this interest on your total balance. This means the interest you earn will eventually earn interest. So the more often your interest is compounded, the more your account balance will grow over time. Financial institutions typically advertise most savings account to have a compound interest rate. You usually would also have to pay some income tax on the interest earned from these accounts. Each year, your financial institutions, whether it be TD, RBC, whichever bank you're with, will send you a return of investment income slip, which is known as your T5. You'll submit it along with your personal income tax return. The T5 will show how much investment income you've earned for that given tax period. You should also read the terms of the agreement, as you may have to pay a fee if you break any restrictions, like in case you went over the number of approved transactions or free transactions. With that said, in the current economic environment, interest rates are still pretty low. Savings account may work best as an emergency or a rainy day fund rather than as an investment. So next, I will pass it off to Aiden, who will speak about credit.
Actually, very quickly, before we pass it off, I believe Fiona has her hand up.
Oh.
Fiona, did you have a question? If not, and if that was done by accident, that's totally fine.
No, I just wanted to know what is the best place to, like, where can we get the maximum interest? Where should we invest our money?
I saw that question in the chat as well. You know what? We don't have an investment as a topic today, but I will add it to the Q&A at the end. There are some general guidelines, but that will really depend on the situation, on each person and things like that. So we'll speak to it very generally at the end. And I'll note your questions so we get to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All good? Aiden?
All right, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the introduction, and thank you for going through debit and checking account and savings account. So that being said, I'm going to transition into a realm which is somewhat similar, but also completely different in the form of credit. And really, at the end of the day, I know a question going through a lot of your minds is, what is credit? It's a word that's always thrown around, but it never truly seems to be defined. And ultimately, understanding what it is can allow for an understanding of how best to manage it. So to put it simply, credit is a 3-digit numerical score, and it's tied to your name. It's created the first time you borrow money or apply for credit. So you can have bad credit, good credit, or anything in between as seen from that spectrum below. The credit spectrum usually ranges from numbers like 300 representing bad credit to all the way to 850 representing good credit, but different places do use different numerical systems and different standards, so that might shift a little bit. Now on the next slide, I'm not going to move there yet, but I will discuss exactly how it's calculated, so don't worry about that for right now. But until then, ultimately, credit represents how trustworthy you're considered to be in your financial decision-making, and it represents the opinion of money lending organizations in regards to how reliable you are with money. So in such a way, it determines how willing they would be to trust you with different financial ventures. So if they don't think you're trustworthy, they're not going to approve you for a financial venture, because they don't think you're going to be able to pay them back. And really, it impacts a lot in life. And I'll turn this question over to you guys if you want to answer either in chat or by raising your hand, but can you name anything in life that can be impacted by your credit score? If not, that's okay too. We have, there's a whole number of different ways it can apply. So we have a great one from Angela there. Mortgage loans, both of those, and another one from Alexander, which both of them I'm going to touch on. So yeah, those are some great examples. The first major one is loans. It determines how the loans are going to be given out, the time relation, and how fast they want them back. It also impacts mortgage rates for cars and houses. And just as Della touched on there, it also impacts things like renting in terms of cars, landlords for houses, and anything along those lines too. So as you can see, it's really wide ranging in terms of its impacts on life. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about how credit is calculated in the first place. So moneylenders do send information to credit bureaus who use this information to tabulate their score. Different credit bureaus do use different formulas to tabulate it, so it might not be exactly the same everywhere, but ultimately there are 2 key facts that govern credit. The first of which is you get points and you raise your score if you're able to manage your credit responsibly, and you lose credit if you manage your credit poorly. So for example, let's take paying credited payments as an example, such as on a credit card when it's time to pay that bill. If you are to pay it on time, and you pay at least the minimum payment, and you don't go over the card limit, then all of these show financial responsibility, which means your credit score is going to go up. However, if you pay it later, not at all, that shows poor management, which means your credit score is going to go down. Now, the most important thing is that credit can change over time based on how you're managing your credit and how you're applying that in the first place. So for instance, the longer you have a credit account in use and the longer you're using it responsibly, the better your score will be. So the advice that I'd have for all of you is to get started early and get started simply. It can be really easy just as a student, for instance, to get a student credit card and make sure you're putting little purchases on them and then paying them off early on time and trying to pay off everything, but at least minimum payment. That'll make sure you're increasing your credit rating over time, setting a good precedent for future in life. So moving on to the next slide, I do understand that this is a lot of information. It can be worrying, but there's 2 basic tricks which can really help you in terms of all this mental load. So first of all, it will be really important to track your income versus expenses to moderate how much money is going in versus going out. This will ensure you're never living beyond your means in terms of paying more than you're making, which could get you into trouble with credit agencies if you owe more than you can pay back. And secondly, as I put there with that photo, you definitely can and should seek professional advice for problems or even just recommendations. The world of money and the world of credit is a very complicated world. And we do have financial advisors who've gone to school and are paid for making these decisions. So at the end of the day, if you don't know what to do or you want recommendations and advice, then they're the professionals who you should go to because they know best and they've studied it. That being said, I'll pass it over to Alex, who's going to inform you about another difficult round with financial issues in the form of taxes.
All right, thanks, Adnan. So here we got everyone's favorite topic of personal taxes. So maybe I'll look to get some responses from the audience to start. Why don't you give a thumbs up if this will be the first year you will be filing Canadian taxes? Okay, so yeah, I mean, well, yeah, as Stephen alluded to in the section on mental wellness, you know, there's that pie chart he showed where you know, different areas of life could be a source of a mental stressor, and finances, specifically taxes, is one of them. And you know, every single year, you know, tax filing is one of those things that, you know, we all do. And it's, you know, it's something that can be stressful, especially if your taxes are complex, or if you've never done it before, or if you're doing it for the first time in a different country. So definitely, it can be an area of stress, but it doesn't have to be. So why don't we start with looking at the activity of tax filing itself, and why filing is important. So, I mean, similar to many, you know, countries around the world, you know, taxes at the, I guess, at the federal level, and in Canada, the provincial level, are, you know, received from wages earned, and that you know, is obviously used to fund a lot of, you know, public services that are offered in society, as well as, you know, other things like, you know, the building of infrastructure in your city, your healthcare system, your education system. So documenting, you know, exactly, you know, how much taxes are being paid is really key for governments to plan and budget for how much spending they can do within any given year or into the future. So that's why, you know, documenting sources of income and the taxes paid on that is extremely important. Another reason why filing is important is because there's a number of deductions that a taxpayer, so everyone on the call here, can claim to help reduce the amount of taxes that will be paid. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide on what that looks like. So what exactly is needed when filing taxes? So residency, so proof of residency is very key. That's number one. And there's, you know, other things that are needed. Again, I'll elaborate a little bit into that on the next slide. But different expense receipts, whether that's moving expenses that you incurred when moving to Canada or moving to Edmonton, any medical expenses, tuition, education, and you know, proof of income and other tax slips that you may have received in the mail. So we'll move on to the next slide here, and we'll go over things that that one can deduct on their taxes. So number one is tuition and textbook costs. So I think everyone on the call here is paying tuition. It's currently paying tuition, or has at least paid tuition in the past, and that can be claimed on your when filing your taxes, and you know, that will help reduce the amount of taxes that you will need to pay. So claiming tuition actually reduces the taxable income that you report to the government. Other things like moving expenses to Canada, you know, childcare expenses, other medical expenses, professional dues, or even things, you know, I think, you know, Mike made reference to is, you know, investment contributions to a registered retirement savings account. So that's something in Canada where contributions to that type of registered account will actually, you know, help reduce or provide you a tax credit when filing your taxes. So there's a number of tax slips that you will receive or maybe receive, but you definitely need when filing your personal taxes. I guess, I've listed some of the main ones here. There's quite an exhaustive list of the different forms out there. And, that those are referenced in our appendix at the end of the presentation here. But number one is the T4 statement. So everyone who works in Canada will receive this form or this statement that essentially summarizes the income that you've earned and the taxes that you have paid on those wages earned. In addition to that, actually, maybe I'll expand on that a little bit. You can receive more than one T4 statement if you earn income from different employers. So if you have maybe 2 part-time jobs, you will receive a T4 slip from each employer. A T4A statement. So these are statements that summarize any scholarships that you received, bursaries, grants, fellowships. So in the eyes of the Canadian government, that is in a way, seen as income, or at least money coming in during the year. T5 statement. So this is, I think Mike alluded to this. So this is interest that was earned on investments. So, the interest earned on that is treated as income. So there's a portion of that interest income that goes towards, or is taxable, at least in non-registered accounts. And then finally, I think this is another pretty relevant tax form to most folks on the call here, is a 2202A form. So this is a form that highlights tuition, education, and other fees related to schooling, a textbook amount, certificate, and any other eligible tuition amounts for deduction. And this form is available on Bear Tracks, usually around, if I can remember when I last received mine, usually around February, March timeframe is when that form is available. So that's so it'll have all of that summarized. Okay, so as if that wasn't overwhelming enough, how does one go about filing personal income tax? So you can certainly go about doing it yourself. There's a lot of self-serving applications or tools such as TurboTax, UFile, SimpleTax, and other softwares out there that you can do. If you're feeling, brave and confident, especially doing it for the first time, but I think a lot of folks would find it intimidating, especially doing it for the first time in Canada. So there's a free tax clinic at the U of A. So that can be a source that you can use to start your personal tax filing. The clinic will not only provide guidance as to how to file taxes, but it'll definitely give guidance on what is needed, and a little bit more in depth than what's on these slides here, but a little what is needed when going through that tax filing process. And then alternatively, you can certainly use an accountant. So you can hire an accountant for personal tax filing services, and they will certainly give you that same guidance as to what exactly is needed for your tax filing, as well as maybe some efficient ways in which you could minimize your taxable income. So yeah, those are kind of the primary ways to go about filing income tax. I personally like doing it myself, but again, at the same time, I'm a bit weird in that sense, I suppose. Okay, well, I will hand it right over back to Stephen to continue on with understanding your paycheck.
Sounds good, thanks. So now that you generally know how to file your taxes, and if any of you are getting your T4s, that means you are also most likely getting your paychecks in some way, shape, or form, whether that be online or a paper version. I know I've gotten both over the course amount, but one thing we kind of wanted to go over is just to kind of what it really looks like, and kind of how to understand some of these things, because some of these things are never really explained to anyone. And then if you're looking at your paycheck for the first time, you know that you make a certain amount, and then you look at it and you're like, this doesn't really make sense. So We're kind of going to go over that a little bit. So first part is the total gross pay. So that's how much you are paid, so to speak, or how much you should be paid. And then net is how much you actually take home. So what you actually get in your account. So some of the general mandatory deductions that exist within Canada are your Canada pension plan. So this is a mandatory percentage of your income that you pay. Generally, it's around 5.45%-ish, give or take. And then the idea of it is that you are supposed to be able to use it when you are 65. So it's kind of like a mandatory pension plan that is like funded through this tax system. So you basically take out your CPP contributions once you're after 65. So that's one of the things that kind of exists for you. It's kind of like unfortunately, it's a mandatory part. And it's kind of sucks if you don't really plan to stay in Canada until you're after 65, to be honest with you, but is what it is. Another part is employment insurance. So EI, I'm sure many of you might have heard of it throughout the duration of this pandemic because it has popped up a lot. And in terms of whether that be the federal government beefing this up, changing the criteria, such and such. So general gist of it, it's also a percentage that you pay. Basically your employer pays from your paycheck, and then the employer and you also contribute a little bit. And this is just to kind of cover you if you ever experience involuntary job loss. So as I'm sure many are aware of, during the pandemic, a lot of people were laid off due to reasons not their own. So the EI was basically a system that you could kind of get some income supplementation while you were waiting for or like looking for another job or trying to like figure out what to do, so that you didn't have to go on to like other social supports that exist. So there are some criterias in terms of what makes you eligible for when you're EI, but generally if you work a certain amount of hours, you will be able to withdraw EI when you are involuntary paid, and then you'll generally be able to withdraw up to a range of certain weeks or up to a certain amount. Generally, you can only it only works out to be around either 55% of your average like weekly income or up to a max of like $638 per week. So it's not a whole lot of money over the course of a month, regardless with EI. But both of these are things that you do have to pay into. And generally, you'll never have to like deduct these. Your employer will be responsible for all of this stuff. The next part is your income tax, so federal, provincial. Generally, when you start out at an employer, they'll give you a form. I remember the first time I looked at it, I was like, I don't know what this form is at all. I'm so confused. Generally, it's a form that basically says what you might be claiming for deductions for your income tax. So what that kind of does is that will decrease the amount of deductions that decrease the amount of income tax that they take from your paycheck. But you can also leave those all at zero, and you will basically, when you file your taxes according to the instructions of Alex, you can kind of like do those deductibles then. It's just kind of a different way of doing your taxes. It's really up to you. But that is something that will impact your income taxes. So in the next slide, you'll see that there are a couple of things that might not exist. So these are more niche specific that might not exist on everyone's paycheck. So they could be things like vacation pay. So certain organizations allow you to get paid time off. But some organizations, so I used to work for the Students Union for a while, and they would give me a percentage of my hourly pay as vacation pay instead. So that is something that could exist on your paycheck. If you're working holiday or overtime wages, that's a thing that will also exist. Sometimes benefits, so like any health and dental benefits, can be taken out of your pay. Once again, it depends on your organization, how they organize all of these things. If you're in like a union or professional due, those fees also might come out on your paycheck. And then your registered retirement savings plan. So this is a tax-free shelter account that exists for you to put money into for you to withdraw at later points. But if you're contributing to that as part of either for yourself or part of an employment plan, generally those will also show in your paycheck, especially if you are also, being charged, like if you're getting matched by your employer. So there's some things that you might come across on your paycheck in your day-to-day. And I will pass it to Nick to kind of take it from the next step of what you would do once you get your paycheck.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about budgeting and planning, which I think is a really great way of tying in a lot of what we've covered. We've covered a ton of material. We've covered a ton of things related to general mental wellness. And there's a lot of very, detailed financial topics that we've covered. So, when we get to budgeting, I think one of the first things I want to recognize is the fact that there's a lot of common perceptions, right? Budgeting tends to be one of those topics that can be intimidating. There's a lot of information you have to take into account with budgeting. It can be time consuming. Just trying to bring all that information for how it works with respect to your life together. It can be scary, just to even consider, what's coming in and what's going out of the bank account. And it can be boring, like many of these other topics. Perhaps there's other perceptions that, a number of you might have felt or heard about when it comes to budgeting. And I would encourage you to throw those words in the chat if any come to mind. But what I'm hoping to do, at least to some extent, is change some of those perceptions, some that reflects what I think is possible with budgeting. The first point being that I think it's a topic that is easily informed. It just needs to be done with intention. And it can actually be quite efficient, especially once you've started. It becomes one of those things that has momentum and you can carry it through month by month, year by year. And you'll find that it can be very helpful to do that with that limited continuous effort. And unfortunately, I don't know if I'll be able to change the perception about it being boring. I think for many, it'll probably still be boring after this, but what can you do? So yeah, next slide. So when it comes to budgeting, there's really 5 steps that I think one should consider at the highest level when we try to build what it looks like for your personal situation. The first step is you need to identify your needs. And that's really a key there. The word needs is, we're not talking about the watch that you want or, the things that are beyond your basic necessities. It really is thinking about the absolute basics. Then we can turn those needs into expenses. And those expenses are going to be the basis. And, with budgeting, I think it's common for it to be built up with expenses first. And the reason is because that's going to be where you can either start taking things away and it'll really show you where the money is going. And income is something we have a lot less control over. And so the third step is where you then compare those expenses that you've come up with to your income. Step number 4 is evaluating that difference. In some cases, you might find that you're actually doing just fine. You have the income to cover your expenses that meet your basic needs. And the last step is actually bringing it into more of a continuous cycle, is making adjustments and monitoring your situation. Life is complicated, and for each one of us is going to change semester by semester, year by year, right? And so a couple of things I want us to keep in mind as we think about budgeting is, firstly, that your needs better than anyone else. And so I think it's easy to think, there is a huge amount of information online. You can go to any number of financial advisors, but they're not going to be able to tell you your needs as well as you can tell yourself what those needs are. And so, respect the fact that you have that information and let it empower you to start building that budget. The second point there is, with budgeting, I think this tendency towards guilt and fear is very natural, right? But by doing that, it actually will make it harder for you to stick to your budget. And so you might find, okay, actually my expenses aren't being covered by my income, but that, don't feel guilty. We all have different circumstances, and it's best to just evaluate what you can change and move on. And that way you're not going to be scared of looking at your budget each month or each year. and you'll be able to keep the monitoring aspect up to date. So in the last slide, I mentioned needs, and here's where I like thinking about budgeting in relation to Maslow's hierarchy. And so some of you might have seen this hierarchy. It's a way to describe, us as humans and what we need to live and actually feel some sense of fulfillment as you start from the bottom of this pyramid and work your way to the top. You're meeting the needs that keep you alive, essentially. Whether that's water, food, having a place to sleep, and you move up from there, right? So things like safety needs, and modern society, there's a lot of things that are even a bit intangible. Things like security of your information, and these are things that you don't want to ignore, right? If there's costs associated with that, those would still fall under something that you'd want to budget for. Even things like health insurance, going to the gym. You're seeing health is one of those things that's listed in the safety needs. It has impacts on the rest of your life, and so you want to make sure that you can account for that. You want to make sure that you're making time to keep yourself healthy, because that's only going to make you more likely to succeed in many ways. We get to the middle of the pyramid, and now you're seeing love and belonging. And I think this really ties well into a lot of what Stephen talked about at the start of this presentation. You need friends, you need family. And the moment you lose that network of support, where that's what can carry you through the more challenging times in your life, whether it's midterms or something a lot worse, the harder it's going to be to continue succeeding at whatever it is you're doing. And so that might look different ways for different people and for different budgets. It might mean you agree to hang out with your friends or your classmates, but perhaps you make dinner at home and you just join them to have a drink, or you just join them in person without actually spending money if they're going out to dinner, for example. If you have family abroad, right? If a lot of you are likely in that scenario where you want to actually think about that. You want to say, I want to put money every month towards a fund where I'll be able to travel back, during the summer to see my family, if that's something that would be applicable to your situation. Because the moment you lose that, it's going to make it very difficult to, again, be your best version of yourself. You get to the top two, and I'm kind of lumping them together. These are things that a lot of the more long-term financial elements, I think, can support the best. So this is things like investing money for years and years so that you can start a business one day, so that you can travel. These are things that will really help with kind of giving nodes along the journey of your life to look towards and to set as goals. And so, of course, those are going to be things that you plan for after all of the needs below are met. And so when you're thinking about your budget, that's exactly the same way I would start looking at it. You do need to start with those basic needs, and then you work up from there. And the other thing is, again, because all of our budgets are going to look different, be as detailed as you need to be. So, for example, if we take the physiological needs of say, food, some of you might actually be fairly comfortable putting, say, a line item that says groceries, and perhaps it's $250 a month, right? And some of you might actually see that maybe your grocery bill actually varies quite a bit from month to month. And in that case, you might want to actually focus on the different, deli, produce, any other detailed breakdown of your groceries that you think is important for you to understand. And so there's no right way to do that, but as long as you can connect with the way that you've broken it down, that's really the important thing. So we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So with expenses, one way after you've figured out the detail that you've wanted to break things down to is you can start categorizing. And this is where you can do things like, in that grocery example, if that's an area that is highly variable, you'll be able to categorize it as, the grocery section, and you can actually keep a closer eye on it because you've broken it down to that detail. And on the flip side, if you don't need to do that for, say, your cell phone bills or other recurring utilities, rent, you're not going to need to categorize that necessarily because you're not going to be as concerned about that. It's going to be more consistent from year to year. Now, an important thing when it comes to, especially being a student, is things can have variable frequency during the year. So you might have things that you have to pay once per year. You might have things that you have to pay once per semester, things like your tuition. Now, when it comes to building a budget, it's generally always recommended that you have it broken out into either by month, and then potentially you can also have it as per year. But when you want to break these items that are semester based, like say tuition, into monthly amounts, you'll need to actually prorate that, right? You have to divide it by the 4 months in the semester. And that way you're not missing them. You're still including in your budget. It's just being reflected in a way that can line up with the rest of your expenses. On the income side, you'll see a couple of similar themes. In this case, the first point is talking about reliability. So, income streams, especially as you're going through school, can be extremely variable. You might get a scholarship one year, you might not get the same scholarship the next year. You might have a part-time job for maybe a few months of the year. You might have it for just the summer, and maybe it's a full-time position. And so you're going to have to actually take that into account. And that might mean splitting your budget up, say semester by semester. And so you have a monthly budget for each semester, maybe a different one for summer versus while you're in your studies. And that might be a way to keep things a bit clearer for you. You might even have things like, let's say you're a research assistant or a teaching assistant, and perhaps you're getting paid, but it's maybe only the first 3 months of the 4-month semester. Again, this is a place where you don't want to completely ignore that last month. You want to make sure that you're dividing that 3 months of income into the 4 months that you actually have expenses ongoing. So that's another important thing to keep in mind as you consider your varied income sources. Next slide. So you've taken into account your needs. You've looked at Maslow's hierarchy to develop what's the most basic all the way to long-term goals and where that might fit in your financial picture. You've looked at your income. You've prorated it so that it lines up with your expenses. And now you're going to have some difference. They're not going to be perfectly equal. You're either going to have a shortfall or a deficit, or you're going to have a surplus. And so if we think about the first scenario where you have a shortfall, so your income's not actually covering your expenses for whatever period you're looking at, whether it's the semester or the year, the first thing to consider is that as a student, that's actually not unusual. Like, that's a perfectly reasonable position to be in. But you have to understand that that money has to come from somewhere. So if you have savings, you'll have to figure out how long your savings might last. If it lasts you the whole semester or the whole year, great. You can make sure that you keep the savings in whether it's the savings account or some combination of savings and investments. You'll be able to keep that available so that you can cover that shortfall that you're inevitably going to have. And so another point here is just acknowledging that it is a normal thing. That, there's going to be some periods in your life where you're going to have shortfalls, and that's not going to be perpetual, hopefully. But don't treat it as again, one of those things to feel guilty about. It's more important to react to it objectively and try to come up with a practical solution. So, for example, as you go through month or semester and you monitor your expenses, you might find that, say, last month, you spent a bit too much dining out if you've put everything in the dining out category. And so one practical way is maybe you're not going to change the frequency, but maybe you change the types of places you dine out at, right? Go to some cheaper places. It's a perfectly valid way to address a shortfall. Now, when it comes to shortfalls that might not be covered by, say, your savings, that's where you think about the larger set of options you might have, things like student loans, other support services, but you'll only know that once you've seen the difference. Now, if we think about the better scenario that I'm sure we all want to be in, which is a surplus, that's great, but you still need to do something about that surplus, because the last thing you want is to have a surplus where you've got money piling up in a checking account that's not paying you anything. And that's where things like what Mike talked about with savings accounts, it's a duration-based thing. If you're going to eventually need that money to, say, travel back to visit family, you'll want to make sure that that's in probably a savings account, right? You want to be able to access it in a few months. You're not going to want to be subject to, the whims of the market. If it's a savings for something like, a long-term goal, or just, maybe you don't even have a goal. Maybe you just want to save money and you want to invest it. Then that's where you can think about putting some of that towards investments. And that's a determination you should make each year as surplus levels change. And one of the things that Mike also mentioned was this idea of an emergency fund. And there's a lot of guidelines for what an emergency fund should look like in terms of the size of it. But one that I tend to hear often is 3 months of expenses, right? So once you've already built your budget, you actually know what 3 months of expenses looks like, and you can simply make sure that's available in something like a savings account. And so in either case, whether it's a deficit or a surplus, this gets back to that step 5 of monitoring your budget over time. And the idea isn't you look at every dollar that's changing from month to month or semester by semester. The idea is that you look at large deviations, right? Don't let those large deviations become a habit. The moment you notice it, create that practical path forward for yourself. Create an action plan that addresses those deviations. And so with budgeting and planning, there's a lot of tools that are available to you. There's free budget apps like Mint and Wally, I think, are both ones that are commonly used in Canada. There's plenty of paid apps that you can also use. And there's also most spreadsheet programs, whether it's Google Sheets or Apple Numbers or Microsoft Excel. If you press a new file, a new template, often there'll be multiple versions of budgets. And I think the key there is don't be afraid to take one of those and start modifying it. Make it that the level of detail that works for you. Make the categories that make sense to you in whatever point in your life you're in. And so with that, I'll pass it to Adnan for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. So hopefully you guys in the audience now have an understanding of both the interplay between financial literacy and mental health, and also now have an understanding of different ways to help improve both. We will later just briefly go through a few helpful resources that can help you in your way, as Nick was talking about before. But before that, we do have some time for questions if you have any. And as Radha did say, you can either put your hand up and speak, or you can send a chat right to her, and we can read it directly from there. So also just going from that question that we did receive before about investment, I know Mike did say that as of right now, the investment percentage that you would get back from your principal is not very high in the savings account, as it's due to the Canadian economy and the world economy. There are different avenues that you can go through as well in terms of one is a GIC, which is a guaranteed investment certificate. So in that one, your principal is guaranteed, but in terms of other investments, the general rule is the higher percent you would get back, usually the higher risk of losing your principal. But if anybody has anything else to speak to that, then definitely go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Thank you, Adnan. So that's absolutely right. There's lots of different places to invest. I will say, though, there are certain laws and regulations around giving financial advice. So we can't really tell you where you should be investing your money. But there are some options. You can invest in the stock market, you can invest in mutual funds. Those are all options available to you. My best recommendation would be to either do a bit of research on your own if you have the time. And if not, your bank is always willing to talk to you. So as long as you have a bank account, pick up the phone, visit your branch, and ask them what options you have. You can always invest through your bank as well. They absolutely offer that function, so you can talk to them to see what you can do there. Otherwise, there are resources online for you to learn more about investing. There are robo investors and apps that you can use to invest your money. I'll make sure that on the resources slide that we send out, there will be a section on investment resources.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, Therna.
I just said thank you so much for answering that question.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then I'll one more thing, we will send out a post-event survey, and one of the topics there that we ask you about is investing. Like, would you like to learn more about investing? So if that is something of interest to you, please fill it out and then vote for that option. And then, yeah, that's all I have to say about that topic. One question that we did receive in the chat was, how do I check my credit score? Adnan, I know you did that section. Is that something you want to take?
Yeah, for sure. So I was also going to go through this a bit in terms of the resources afterwards as well. But one really invaluable way, which you can see being here in Canada, is just going through the Canada Revenue Agency. And if you go, or also known as the CRA, so that's kind of the general base for Canadian revenue and everything about that. And when you go on that website, you'll find a number of different avenues to go through, whether it's information about taxes, credit, and all of that. So that is one way where you could potentially find your credit score. As I said, though, different places do calculate credit slightly differently. So various credit bureaus have different calculations, but the CRA is one place where you could find that credit score, which is a general view of what the CRA believes your credit score to be.
Thanks, Adnan. Another question we got was about, well, this wasn't really a question, but somebody made a comment about loan status. And I just wanted to speak to it quickly, just in case people weren't aware. As international students, loan status is, or we're not able to take loans, at least regular ones, from financial institutions. The loans that are available sometimes can be from not official, like financial institutions with really, really high interest rates, or the payback schedule is not in your favor. So it's highly, highly recommended to avoid those types of loans if possible, and try and look for other resources. So we'll talk about this a little bit too, but your university has lots of resources for you if you really need money for living expenses and things like that. We got a question about TFSA. Is there anybody on the Global Shapers team want to take this question?
Sure. I can't see the question there, Rada. Because I'm kind of presenting here. Yeah.
Sorry, Alex. The question is just what are TFSAs about?
Sure. So a TFSA is something that is specific in Canada. So it stands for tax-free savings account. And it's something that the federal government, I guess, started a number of years ago, where every single year, everyone is, I guess, allowed to invest a certain number of dollars that year tax-free. And so what that means is, say, this year, the TFSA limit is $6,000. You are able to put $6,000 into that account, and any investments that you buy with that amount of money that you, say, sell and make a profit, all of those gains are tax-free. And so, pulling that money out, you don't get taxed on any of that, unlike just a normal, non-registered account where you buy and sell investments. Any gains that you realize would actually be taxed as income. So that's a huge benefit of the tax-free savings account. And so every year, the limit is there's a limit of how much money you can put in every single year, and that just accumulates, right? So in, say, 2022, it's 6,000. Next year, maybe the federal government will raise it to, say, 7,000, and then next year it'll be 8,000. So if you had never put in any money yet, and you're, I guess, above the age, ever since you were the age of 18, you have all of that cumulative room to fill up in your TFSA, if that makes sense. So it's definitely, I quite value having a TFSA and filling it up as much as possible, to really take advantage of the fact that, any investments in there that are compounding over time, eventually when you pull it out, say during retirement or when you need that money, any gains that you would have realized upon the sale of those investments are tax-free.
I might add a bit more to that.
Yeah, for sure.
One point is just regarding the fact that TFSAs are open for residents of Canada. And I think there's some stipulations as to the definition of that as it relates to TFSA. And so, for example, if I think you have to be a resident in Canada for at least half of the year to be eligible as a resident to open up a TFSA. And of course, you have to be over the age of 18. And another piece I'd point out is just the fact that, a TFSA is ultimately a savings vehicle, but what you do within that vehicle can be as broad as a savings account, exchange traded funds, or individual stocks.
Thanks, Alex and Nick. The next question is about NFTs, and I have the same answer as previously. We can't give you any financial advice. We can't tell you where to invest your money. We can tell you where to get that information, though. So we can share something about NFTs in the resources if you'd like. But the answer is, again, it depends. It depends on what you're interested in investing in, what value you see in them, how educated you are on the topic, and things like that. So it's not a great answer, I'm sorry, but we'll make sure there's some resources when we send out the slides.
Rada, no one has purchased my NFTs yet, so perhaps I'm not the best person to offer advice on that area.
I don't know if we're allowed to advertise NFTs at this call either, so.
Oh, perfect. There you go.
The next question is about difference in doing your own taxes versus going to a firm. And then the rest of the comment says, I know there's TurboTax that can be bought in stores. There's lots of other tools to do your taxes with, but I'll pass this off to maybe Alex to start, since you did the taxes section.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, personally, I use TurboTax. I really like the software. It's very user-friendly. It's easy to use. I mean, my taxes are a little complicated. I enjoy doing it. I'm very familiar with the forms, the materials. So I think, the comparison between doing taxes yourself versus essentially getting someone else or a professional to do it is, I guess, understanding of what you're doing and difficulty. and I guess maybe, peace of mind that it's being done correctly. I suppose there's that as well. Like if you don't feel confident in doing it yourself, it's overwhelming, there's a lot of forms, it's, or if it's just very complex, maybe you're filing taxes in multiple countries during a given year. You have multiple sources of income, you have investments, you have, capital gains that you're trying to claim on a residence that you sold overseas. There's a number of things that could make your taxes complex. So, I think that reason alone is why someone would seek more professional help in filing taxes. Obviously, if you're filing taxes with a professional, that's going to cost more money than just doing it yourself. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't, let that deter you from seeking, a professional accounting services. But, there's no, hard set, advice as to, whether you should file taxes yourself or not. It definitely is a personal preference. And like I said, that depends on your, confidence or understanding of what you're dealing with, the complexity of your taxes, and perhaps, just the cost of paying for a tax software to do it yourself versus paying for professional accounting services.
One other thing to consider as well, sorry, Nick, to cut you off, is that it's like if you go through a professional tax person, they can also, they might help you with like your tax deductions or tax credits that you might not be aware of or think about. So that's always helpful if you are worried that, you can do certain things with your tax credit or tax deductions that you aren't aware of. And you can also do a combination of both, to be honest with you. I definitely did my first couple of years in university, got it filed to the tax clinic, and then I shifted online or to my own taxes, because then I was more aware of what exists. So that's also an option, is just to do both. So you kind of know what they did, what they might have claimed, ask some questions there. And the next time you're more well equipped to file your own taxes and do that.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to add was actually just about planning. One of the benefits of either walking through your taxes with a professional and doing it yourself through some of these tax software that's available is that it helps you think about areas that could be deductions in the future for you. You can think about them, say, a deduction that you didn't realize, like moving expenses, you can plan for that if that's coming up in the next calendar year.
Yeah, thanks everyone. All great points. As an international student, I was an international student when I first came here about 6 years ago, and I did my own taxes. I've used Simple Tax, and being completely honest, I did them wrong the first year or two. And I literally just corrected them last year. So if you do them yourself, please use a tool that can make things easier. If you make mistakes, it can be corrected later. So I make sure that I'm really thorough and go back and check and recheck. The mistake that I did was ended up with me getting less return. So obviously I didn't get in any trouble, but to make sure that I got the return back, I had to go back and do a lot of documentation. So just an FYI, those things do happen. And another resource is the tax clinic at the University of Alberta. They do it for students for free, and you can always go to them for help. International Student Services also helps you out with your taxes. So you can just go there, show up, call them and ask, I need help doing my taxes, and they will either help you out or point you in the right direction. We have just received another question about improving your credit score. So Adnan, if you want to take this, it's asking, in terms of improving your credit score, is it okay to pay back immediately the credit that you use?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Alexander, for the question. So I'd say not only is it okay to pay it back, but if you want to show you're managing your credit responsibly, then it is even encouraged to. So as I said before, one of the things that goes into calculating that is how responsibly you are acting financially with your money, and paying that back, but making sure it's paid back before the deadline ensures you're showing them that you have the ability to pay it back, which will improve your credit score. So it doesn't necessarily matter how far in advance of the deadline you pay it back, just as long as you keep repeatedly paying it back before the deadline. And as you said there, paying it back in full will definitely be a good way to make sure your credit score keeps going up over time. So I guess that being said, and seeing no questions, we can quickly move on to a few of the resources we have here. And knowing that a vast majority of you are at the U of A, we included 4 kind of key resources here from the U Alberta. And you'll see that 3 of them there are bursaries and 1 of them is a loan. And I'll just quickly run through the difference between bursaries and loans. So bursaries are non-repayable, which means you don't have to pay them back. Each of those 3 bursaries listed there are going to have different eligibility criteria, which can be found on their websites, which we do have linked a few slides later, and I'll just show them when we go through them. Loans do need to be repaid at some point, and as I kind of talked about in my credit rating, the longer you go without paying that loan back or without paying that principal of the loan back, there's going to be interest applied to that. So if you do go a longer stretch without paying it back, the amount that you do pay back ends up being greater because of the interest that's applied there. So as we can move on to the next slide, this will give a few links to another resources, and I'll just point out 2 really important ones there. It's going to be the top one, the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. That's almost can be considered the holy grail of anything money related in Canada. It has so many resources, as I said before, about taxes, credit information, and almost anything you can find there. And one other I'll give a shout out to, I guess, is citizenship and working in Canada. So that might be found to be very useful by a number of you if you are internationals, if you are maybe looking towards the idea of citizenship and working in Canada, and it'll take you through a lot of the basics that need to be accomplished to reach that ultimate goal. And moving on to the last slide there, as I said before, in terms of U Alberta students, and as was frequently mentioned throughout, the University of Alberta does have a student service center where it makes sure that it's providing you with good information about taxes, debit, anything you might be wanting to look up there. And as I mentioned before, there's the links to the bursary and the loans. And lastly, you can see those 2 links there about international student work and working in Canada for international students, which do have resources inside them which tell you the steps you need to go through, whether it's a work visa, whether it's making sure you have the appropriate certification, and those will definitely provide some clarity in terms of pursuing that work. So I think that's the last we have in terms of the resources there, and I'll hand that back over to Radha. She's going to go through the giveaways that we mentioned at the start of the presentation here.
Before we do that, there is another question. I actually don't know the answer to this question. I'm hoping somebody else is able to help me, but it says, is there a limit of years that a lender is given to collect the loan? My sense is that depends on the loan, but does anybody have any knowledge on loans?
What type of loan is this question referring to?
Maybe Doris, you can help us out here with a bit more context, but I think the rest of the question actually says, like, if you give me a loan today and I don't pay you back for 10 years, what then? Maybe we can go through the most common form of loan.
Yeah, I guess I was, student loans are treated very differently than, say, a loan from a financial institution. Mm-hmm. And so when you take a loan from a bank, I mean, there's usually a repayment period, a repayment schedule that goes along with that loan, kind of like what you would have with a mortgage of your house. And the longer the loan is outstanding for, the more interest you pay over time, to put it simply. So if the loan may have different terms, for example, duration. So how long will you be paying that loan back over? It'll specify the loan will specify the kind of interest that's included with that borrowing of money. And so different loans will look very some may be similar in nature, some may look very different, especially depending on the loan amount. So if the loan is say, you know, $100,000 loan the terms of that loan may look very different than a $5,000 loan. And as for student loans, I can't speak to student loans very well, but I do know that the payment periods are quite lengthy, and I think that's, you know, done on purpose and to allow students that are just graduating school and entering the workforce to, you know, actually give them the ability to pay back a loan in a reasonable amount of time. But I mean, I think student loans can be paid up to over even a 10 or 15-year period. Interest is quite low on those loans. And usually, you know, interest is even deferred for the first year or two post-graduation. So in other words, the loan is interest-free or doesn't bear any interest until, you know, say 1 or 2 years after graduation. So yeah, if anyone has any additional information on that, please feel free to expand.
Another thing, once again, it does depend on the loan and what it looks like, but if you do something like a collateral, if you there are certain banks will require like a collateral for certain loans, like you put something on, or like there's a bunch of different conditions. So I mean, outside the general effects on your credit score, they could take certain assets that you might have if you put them down, depending on, once again, the type of loan, the type of thing that's happening. It could also be sent to collections, which means that like other people will basically continuously try to get the money back from you in some way, shape, or form. So there's also that, and once again, depends on the type of loan, depends on what the contract looks like. There are also legal options that could be pursued by the whoever's loaning you money that could result in like legal action. But once again, these all depend on the loan, but those are some conditions that could result in all of that, aside from like, you know, your credit score stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Alex and Stephen. And just as an FYI, when Stephen said collateral, he was talking about something like an asset that's worth a lot of money. So sometimes your house, you put that on the loan. So if you don't pay it back, the institution is able to take your house if you're not paying back the loan. And loans are often linked to your financial information, your ID, your SIN, your things like that. So that's how they kind of keep track of who owes this loan. And so even if it's 10 years from now, it might still be something that they're collecting. Okay, so it looks like we're at the end of the session.